often hear parents say, my teenager never listens to me. And I tell you that about 25% of the teenagers I see who come in with their parents have parents who say the same thing. How can parents ensure that their voices are heard and their opinions are valued by their almost grown kids? Welcome to Parenting Great Kids. I'm your host, Dr. Meg Meeker, a pediatrician and passionate advocate of father-inclusive parenting. Well, today we have a very special guest joining us, Dr. Emily Kline. She's a Harvard-trained psychologist and renowned expert in fostering meaningful connections between parents and their almost grown kids. Dr. Kline's groundbreaking research and her book, How to Have Real Conversations with Your Almost Grown Kids, have empowered countless families to strengthen their relationships through effective communication. In this episode, we'll explore Dr. Kline's valuable strategies and techniques that will help you engage in conversation that truly connects you with your teens and young adults. Dr. Kline, thanks so much for coming on today.
I am so happy to be talking to you. Thank you.
You know, as parents, we often face challenges when it comes to connecting with older kids. We seem to be okay with the little ones when they're cute and huggy and they don't backtalk a whole lot. What are some of the common obstacles that parents have in communicating with their older kids, teens to young 20s?
I think the really tough thing that most, if not all, families encounter at this stage is that kids are becoming so much more independent. And they don't necessarily want or feel like they need their parents' input. And that really shakes up the power dynamics in the family. You know, parents are used to saying, okay, now you go to soccer practice, now you have a play date, now you come home. And all of a sudden, that dynamic shifts and kids feel like they should be in control. And parents are like, hey, what happened here? We weren't ready for that. Absolutely not. So I think that is kind of the overarching dynamic. And then I think the other piece is that the risky behaviors become so much scarier for the parents. It's no longer like, hey, be careful on the monkey bars. It's like, hey, I don't want you binge drinking. Right? I mean, that feels so much scarier. And so I think that really amplifies parents' anxiety, rightfully so, but it becomes really hard to communicate.
You know, you're absolutely right. And I think that tension between control, parents saying, wait a minute, I have better ideas than you. I'm smarter than you. I've lived longer than you are, 13-year-old. So I know you want control. How do we sort of begin to give our kids a little more control? And does it help with the communication? And when do we know when to back off?
So I guess my answer to that is that we can give over control in lots of little ways that don't cost us much. And we can also work on being better listeners, both because that gives kids more control within the conversation, more control within the family. And also, it means that they're more likely to listen to us when we then want to communicate to them, hey, here's the expectations, and I really do want you to kind of follow my advice. The first, 5 chapters or so of the book is about how to listen better and how to do that active listening to really convey to young people like, hey, I'm listening to you, I'm interested in your perspective. And it's both because I think that that's really nice thing for kids to experience is somebody who really, really listens, but also sneakily, the last 3 chapters are really about so that they'll listen to you.
So it really is about having a backwards conversation. We're so used to going in because we've done it for so many years. Go get dressed, get ready for school. Soccer practice starts at 3, we're going to be late. So we dish out, order after order after order. And now you're sort of saying, we got to be quiet and we've got to ask questions and just listen, even if we don't like the answers our kids are giving us. And that's really hard. So your first chapter is what's a parent's job? What is a parent's job?
Well, it changes a lot, as you're saying, as our kids get older, and by the time kids are, 15, 16, 17 years old, we have so much less control over them. And as you're saying, that it starts happening even earlier than that. Um, but I think that parents can have that job of being close by, being supportive, conveying expectations, offering advice when it's needed, but also asking the questions to be gauging. Does my kid need advice? What kind of path are they on? I liked the example you just gave of sort of a typical Saturday, right? And you're used to saying, hey, get dressed because we're going here and then we're going here. And that's what we might say to my 7-year-old. I say that kind of thing all the time. But, when kids get to be 12, 13 years old, we might ask them, hey, remind me what is planned for today. And even in those kind of small ways, seeing if they, number one, have that awareness of what's going on, and then asking, okay, what do we need to do to get ready? Or what time do you think we need to leave? And it's really this partnership model where we're not putting them in control and saying, all right, good luck. But we're also not continuing to dictate and manage and control all the behaviors. We're trying to establish this partnership where we can say, hey, remind me what's the agenda? What time do you think we need to leave? What laundry needs to be done so that your uniform is clean? And having that partnership where we're kind of guiding through questions, through listening, through advising.
So let's jump into the hard stuff. You have a 15-year-old daughter who knows she's smarter than you, and she's lived a much more, a deeper life than you. And she's going down the wrong track. She's dating a guy who's 18. She's changed her friend groups. Her grades are dropping. And you are very, very concerned. And when you try to talk to her like, hey, honey, I'm noticing something's going on with you, she shuts you down, runs to her room. What do you do?
So I might start by saying, what's the last conversation that you had with her that wasn't kind of challenging or telling her, stay away from this guy, I don't like your new friends. And just kind of invest in some lighter talk or some lighter activities. With little kids, in child treatment, as you know, we advise time in for kids who are really defiant and oppositional. And for little ones, that means just sit and play Legos and don't give any directions, right? Just give that positive attention for 15 minutes. And I think that's also really important for teenagers, even though it looks a little bit different. But thinking about how can I do time in with a 15-year-old? Maybe it's saying, hey, can you show me something funny on TikTok? Or what do you think you're going to wear to that party next weekend? Do you want to show me kind of what outfits you're thinking about? And trying to withhold that judgmental tone from the conversation, just to put a little bit of restored credit in the bank is sometimes the metaphor I use, because we're making so many withdrawals on this relationship. But it's also important to have those conversations. And I don't think that people should avoid them. It can be really useful to start by just asking a question like, tell me more about your boyfriend. What does he like to do? Or how did you guys meet? Or how's his job going? Without kind of coming in with the goal of saying, I don't want you seeing him anymore. Right. And I'm not saying that you don't get there, but that it can be really useful to just try and inhabit her perspective. And learn, okay, well, clearly she sees something in the guy. What is it? And can she tell me about it so that we can get to some shared understanding of what's going on?
So what you're saying is you sort of have to gently move into the relationship and get to the hard stuff slowly. Because I've found too with teenagers in my practice, if you just ask them questions and stay quiet, they come to their own conclusions. Gee whiz, maybe this guy kind of is a jerk. I'll say, is he kind to you? What kind of things does he do that you like? When you go out on dates, does he, pay for you or you pay for him? And in that way, you kind of direct the conversations. What do parents do, however, whose kids really stonewall them. And these are troubled kids whose parents have some real baggage, and they're not healthy themselves. And kids will come in and they sort of want to figure out life, but their parents are, really struggling with some issues. And so a lot of the kids' issues are the parents' issues. How do you sort of tease that apart and talk to the parent about things that they can do to help their teen when they're having a hard time themselves?
I think that most of us are, as parents, are two things. Number one, we're very motivated because we love our kids and we want to be there for them. And of course, also we're limited and we're flawed because we're human beings and nobody's a perfect parent. I try to work with parents, and a lot of the times I actually have stopped doing family therapy sessions. I just work with parents. And it can be kind of useful to get the teenager out of the room because so that you can really hear the whole story and align with the parent. For me as the psychologist, to align with the parent and say, let me understand what's going on from your point of view. And you're right. A lot of the times the parents in these situations, they're dealing with their own traumas. Maybe they're in recovery from their own addiction. They're dealing with depression or something like that themselves. And that's not easy, right? And just as kids need to feel understood and not judged in order to make positive changes in their behavior, so do us as adults, right? So do we, so do these parents. There's hardly been anyone who I've encountered as a parent who I've truly said, wow, that person is like a hopeless case. Like they do not care. They don't want to be there for their kid. I think most people are interested in trying to figure out what's gone so wrong that their child is stonewalling them and maybe trying something different. You know, it's also great for kids to have adults outside sometimes of their families when things truly have taken a wrong turn. A lot of the parents I work with, I ask them, who did you confide in or who did you go to when you were growing up and you had a dilemma or problem? And, you know, I get all kinds of interesting answers, but a lot of the times it was mom or dad. But sometimes it wasn't. It was grandma, it was neighbor, it was, a teacher, a coach. So I think it's nice for kids to also have adults outside of their family.
It was interesting. I was taking my son back to college many years ago, and I was telling him I was going to talk to some parents last night. He said, "What are you going to say?" I said, "I don't know. You tell me what I should say." And one of the things he said to me, which just floored me, is he said, "Tell the parents to have good friends." And I never thought about it. He said, "I always appreciated that you and dad had friends whose values aligned with yours. And so I didn't feel you were so crazy." But often, I see teenagers with their parents in the room, because if I'm seeing a kid with depression, anxiety, parents often see their kids very differently. They see different things, different behaviors in their kids than the kids see in themselves. So I think it's always very important. And what I have found is that often you can get parents to see, gee whiz, I need to make some changes here, not just my kid. Because a lot of times parents will come in with their teenager and they throw them at you and say, "Fix this kid, he won't talk to me." But it really doesn't work that way. You talk about the writing reflex, writing with an RIGHTING. What is that?
So the writing reflex is a concept from a therapeutic style called motivational interviewing, which I write about in the book. And the writing reflex represents that impulse that most of us have to help other people by just trying to fix their problems, by giving them advice or by kind of waving their problems away and saying, "Oh, I don't know what you're so worried about." And I can give you some examples. So like if your child comes home from school and says, "I hate school," as most do at some point, your writing reflex might be to like march into the principal's office the next morning and say, "This kid needs a new teacher," or "This is totally inadequate." Or your writing reflex could also go in the other direction where you say, "No, you don't. Just yesterday you did so well and you were in such a good mood when you got home. What are you talking about?" And I really encourage parents to learn to understand their writing reflex and notice when it's happening. for me as a therapist, that was such an important leap because it actually can get in the way of a deeper level of listening and problem solving. Because you notice neither of the parents in the situation I just described actually learned anything about why that kid is coming home today and saying, I hate school. And it sounds so simple. And we all think we would think to say, oh, why are you saying that? But so much of the time we actually don't ask because that writing reflex kicks in and it is so powerful.
It's very easy to say, oh, come on. You like school. You liked it yesterday. This is silly. And you move forward. But we really can't do that because I think that teaches our kids that we're really not opening to hearing them. So talk about motivating your kids from within, because you talk about that, the motivational listening and the motivation of a child. How is that done?
I trained in a kind of therapy that's like, some people call it Rogerian psychotherapy. It's very idealistic and it's not always on the money for everybody, I will admit. But it's this basic belief that people have a part of themselves that really wants to be healthy, wants good things for themselves and their loved ones. And that a lot of our basic motivation is to improve, to self-actualize, and that sort of psychological language. And the idea that things that when we are not acting in a way that's healthy, it's often because there's something that's kind of maintaining us in the status quo. And that asking people to change can be very challenging, be very threatening for them. And I like to give kind of small, silly examples. If I am doing a big stack of dishes and my husband comes over and is like, oh, you're not supposed to use that kind of sponge with that kind of pan. Like, I get mad, right? Yeah. Like that doesn't feel good. I'm over here working hard. And then you come over here and you're trying to give me advice, but it feels like criticism, right? Or how many of us have been told like, oh, you should just get up earlier so you can go to the gym.
Right.
Or just stop ordering takeout, right?
Right.
All those kinds of things that we know. Like we want to make those positive changes, but something's getting in the way. So the idea of motivational interviewing and motivating from within is to kind of talk to that part of a person, whether it's a teenager or even an adult that wants good things, and talk to that person in a very non-judgmental way about, well, what is getting in the way? Why aren't you, getting to the gym? Or why did you order takeout every night last week? Or, why can't you remember which sponge to use on which pan?
Yeah.
Silly. But, and to really uncover those barriers so that the person themselves can start to think through, what would it take for me to change this? And do I have what it takes? Rather than motivating externally, which is like, when we say, okay, I'll give you $5 if you can manage to make it to the gym. That works for some people. But for a lot of us, it's really not sustainable and nobody's offering us those $5 to begin with.
Right. I often hear parents say, I've got a 16, 17-year-old boy. He's in high school. He's smart, but he won't study. I can't get him to study. Should I bribe him and pay him? How can I motivate him? And, I think a lot of that's a maturity issue. But what would you say to that parent? How do you motivate that 16-year-old boy from within when he just doesn't want to study?
So I think it's a really complicated question, actually. I'd be curious if he shows like sort of a global lack of motivation or if it's really specifically around academics, because a kid who's not motivated to hang out with friends or to, skateboard, bicycle, whatever it is that he likes to do might be someone who's like depressed, right? Whereas a kid who just doesn't want to do his homework, again, is it all the homework or is it specifically for one class? Like what is getting in the way? And how do we drill down? And this is why I say, it's all about having those hard conversations, because we can only figure out the answers by talking to him.
And getting him to sort of realize, gee whiz, maybe this is going on. Because I think with teenagers, it's hard. You can sit down with a 30-year-old and probably by prodding and asking questions, get to the root of what's happening, but it's hard with a teenager. So it's really your job as a therapist or parent to do it because the kid can't do it. I have a number of teenagers who are pre-diabetic. They're very, very unhealthy. They have really bad eating habits. And their parents do something, but it's really hard to figure out, where that is coming from. Of course, I'm not a counselor. I'm not a therapist. What do you do with, say, a 14-year-old who is just dangerously overweight and you need to change a certain behavior that's very powerful in them?
Wow. And I mean, this is your area of expertise and really not mine. So I'm curious, where you have found success with this. For me, I'd be really curious, both talking, as you said, to the parent and to the young person, and getting the parents' observations. Because like you said, I mean, we know that self-observing kind of prefrontal brain development is not completely there in teenagers. So, like you said, they don't always have those accurate self-perception. But I'd be curious to talk to the parents, when are there certain times of day that they tend to be eating more? There are certain foods or certain situations. Is it moments of stress? And really try to talk. I mean, it's such a loaded and difficult subject. But, try as best you can to talk to the teenager in a non-judgmental way to say, hey, your mom noticed that it tends to be, you tend to be eating more in these situations. Have you noticed that? What do you think is going on? And also get their perceptions of what changes are feasible for them to make. Because I know that on the subject of food and exercise and diet, there's just so many suggestions out there circulating in our culture about what's going to help people. And so many of those are like feasible for some people, but not for others. So maybe one kid is a kid who would really love to participate in meal planning and cooking with mom and dad so that there's food that they actually like at family meals and they don't, go for snack attack at 9 p.m. But for another kid, that's not up their alley and there's some other solution that's going to be a better fit.
It's very helpful because I know what I do and I wanted to see what you do. Because it's rare to have a child come in who's really struggling with weight issues, whose parents don't have weight issues and they're pretty healthy. And my belief is that if you want to change a child's behavior, even a teenager, you have to get the parents on board. I hear stuff like this all the time. Well, I don't know why they're overeating because all I bring in the house is healthy food. Okay. And she just doesn't eat much. I watch her and she doesn't eat that much. But what you see is a pattern in the family of one of the parents at least sort of sabotaging the kids, sort of saying, I want to eat healthy, but my husband, is always bringing chips in, is always bringing in candy bars and this kind of a thing. So I think it's important for parents to be involved in that process as well and not just look at the kid and go, okay, how can I get him to change this without a parent changing it as well? So it was a little bit of a trick question, but it was wonderful to see how you would handle it differently than I do. I guess I'm not as nice as you are. I just go, look, you got to help your kid here.
Yeah, no, but it's a good question. And the other thing I would add is just getting the kids buy-in on changes that you're going to make so that it doesn't feel punitive or like something that they're going to kind of try and sneak around to say, okay, we're not going to be bringing these certain foods into the house anymore, and make sure that they sort of have some awareness of why that is, or hopefully are bought into it a little bit.
It's very hard because particularly for girls, gals who are overweight already feel shame and they already feel horrible about themselves. And so you don't want to make them feel worse. You want to make them feel lovely, but that they can sort of change some behavior to get healthier. But I know that's a big one. You also talked about conflict in parent-child relationships. Talk about conflict when a child 13, 14, 15 really wants to do something and the parents really disagree, but they're going to go ahead and do it anyway. And there's always this tension. So talk about conflict when parents don't want their kids to make the decisions they're making.
There's going to be conflict, right? In any
Mhm.
family relationship. It's in any friendship, in any marriage, there's always conflict. And of course, between teenagers, nobody gets out of parenting a teenager or being a teenager without some conflict. So I
Yeah.
think we have to just embrace this as like an unpleasant but kind of normal thing, like, menstrual cramps or acne.
Mhm.
It's like, this is
Right.
Normal. This is part of the experience, right?
Mhm.
Without trying to completely, outsmart the idea that there's going to be conflict. There will always be conflict. But I think that, parents are often, a lot of the times when parents that I'm talking to talk about a behavior or an activity they don't want their child to engage in, my question is like, on a very practical, not ideological level, can you stop them? Right? Can you stop them? And if you can stop them, go ahead and stop them and tolerate the conflict that is going to come because if it's important to you,
Mhm.
because that's part of being a parent and part of sort of expressing your values. But most of the parents I talk to, when we really get into it, they say, well, I can't actually stop them. Right?
Mhm.
Because it's something like, I can't do their homework for them,
Mhm.
or I can't stop them from, being friends with this other child or this other teenager. They're going to do that because they
Mhm.
see them all day at school and that's who they really want to be friends with. And the parent cannot actually stop them from doing it. So it's sort of a different calculation
Mhm.
to me based on whether, let's just take a cold, hard look at this question. Do you have control?
Well, sometimes you do, but you don't think you do. Talk
Hmm.
about phones. Surgeon General just came out and said, "Whoa, social media is very dangerous for kids." And I've seen it. I've seen it firsthand, where girls have gotten into trouble. They've been stalked. They've tried to commit suicide, and they'll actually say, "I had one girl actually say to me, you know what? I was on social media too much, and I felt so bad about myself day in and day out." So parents buy the phones, but then they say, well, we don't have control over what our kids do with them. And I wonder if it's just because they don't want to deal with conflict. Well, what do you say to parents who say, I don't like my kid being on social media, they're on it too much, but there's nothing I can do?
And I've had that same conversation with myself, frankly, about being on social media too much and needing to
Yeah,
delete apps,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So I think that, it is scary because like my adult brain can come to a reasonable conclusion of like, you know what? I don't feel good after I look at this app. I'm going to delete my account.
Hmm.
Done. Right.
Hmm.
And I don't feel like I'm giving up or at least I can weigh the pros and cons in a way that isn't so emotionally and socially fraught for me. I don't worry, oh my God, are my friends gonna all do stuff without me if I'm not on this app? Um,
And your identity is not wrapped in it.
right,
You
right.
know who
Like I
you
know
are.
who I
Yep,
am.
yep,
Right,
yep.
exactly.
Hmm.
So it
Hmm.
is, I think, really, really scary for kids. I don't know what it would be like to grow up in this era. Mark Zuckerberg and I are the same age. So I started using Facebook, in 2004 when he
Hmm.
invented it. But then I stopped, right?
Yeah.
Because I realized it didn't serve me.
Hmm.
But today's kids are just growing up with social media,
Hmm.
which is really different. So I think it is really, that's a tough one. I mean, I think that parents hopefully can have conversations with one another, or, if you're a single parent with a friend who shares your values, where you can really think about, okay, what are the pros and cons of paying for this cell phone plan for my child? Is this something I want to continue doing? Um, and consider the question of like, what apps am I going to let them use? What kind of cell phone or data plan am I going to pay for? What kind of device am I going to pay for? You can get your child a dumb phone. Those still exist, right? The ones that just call people.
Yep. They do have phones that can't connect to the internet, but kids can, text and call or do whatever they're going to do. That's a huge source of conflict that I see with parents. And my encouragement to them is to take more control because they're paying the bills. And a lot of times parents will complain that they can't do anything, but they really can. And there's things you can do without being a jerk, without saying, no, you're not going to have your phone ever. But to sort of put kids sort of on a diet. I hear a lot of parents say, well, what I need to do with my 13 and 14-year-old is train them to how to make good decisions. Can a 13-year-old make the same decision that an 18 or 21-year-old would about cell phone use? How practical is that, is what I'm asking.
Well, I do think that parents often know their kids best, right? And so I know 13-year-olds who I think would make really good decisions. And I know 13-year-olds who I don't think would make really good decisions. And so I think it's not wild to say that, but I also think that, most kids are pretty responsive to parents kind of drawing a line, like you're saying, and saying they might grumble about it, but to say, okay, we put away cell phone, whether it's pretty extreme, maybe for some families to say we've already given the cell phone, but now we're taking it away. But there's also other lines you can draw, like we only use cell phones in the family room. You don't take it into your bedroom.
Right.
Or, we don't use them at dinner. Or, that better be off while you're at school between, 7 a.m. and 3 p.m. Like, I don't want to see any usage. Or just to let your kid know, like, hey, I am, looking at, there's pros and cons to it. I work with parents of young adults who get into this kind of compulsive, dysfunctional thing of looking at cloud backup with their 22-year-old. And that's like a whole different thing. But with a 12-year-old, I think it's really reasonable to say, I'm looking, just so you know, everything that you text backs up to the cloud and I can see that.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
and just
exactly.
that, like, you don't have to read it every day, but just, plant that idea in their head. Like, I can see all this, right?
Right. Because I think it's hard. I don't think it's healthy for kids to be able to live in their own private world, particularly when they're 12 or 13. My guest is Dr. Emily Kline, and her book is The School of Hard Talks: How to Have Real Conversations with Your Almost Grown Kids. Emily, this has been so delightful. It's been very, very helpful for a lot of parents out there who are really struggling with how to get through to their kids. And you've given them some great insight and great tips. So thanks for coming and joining me.
Thanks for having me and for asking such interesting questions. I'm going to be thinking about this conversation.